the moral, the ethical, the intellectual, the astral, the cosmic, the celestial, house not made with hands.
The alchemical axiom or principle of vitriol. Visita interiora terrae, rectificando inveniis occultum lapidum. Visit the interior of the earth, and rectifying therein, you will find the hidden stone.
You know, if you don't transmute yourself first, you will transmute nothing.
The axiom of fixing the volatile and volatilizing the fixed.
Being able to weave hermetic principles into our social fabric.
Filling in the fractal spaces till we get to the most rarefied abstract plane of the celestial realm.
You know, that's alchemy, that's understanding nature.
Question everything.
Symbols are far beyond words, right? Symbols are the touch point where the mind enters into the sublime, incomprehensible, translinguistic depths of a direct connection with the ultimate that I would refer to as the divine.
There is truth in the Western esoteric traditions. It has been contributed to and refined and evolved over the course of millennia by what we can conceive universally to be the greatest minds to ever exist.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Philosophical Minds Podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric. From the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all, join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, joined this evening with operative alchemist, wildcrafter, farmer, clinical herbalist, and educator, the great Daniel Wiseman. How you doing, Daniel?
Doing great tonight. How are you doing, Sky?
Doing wonderful. I'm excited. Glad to always be on with you. This is probably like our fourth podcast or something like that at this point, so always good.
Yeah, I think fourth or fifth now. It's always a good time to ramble on with you.
Yeah, I'm always staying, up with your posts and trying anyway. And so I built up a lot more questions that I wanted to dive into with you, and maybe some things to just refresh myself on as well. The first thing I wanted to touch on was really cool that I saw you had done this post about like crystallization and whatnot, and proper laxivation within the crystallization process. I think this is kind of a cool key point and often maybe underlooked, at least lesser known perhaps, because you get pretty descriptive with like the ratio, the time, the pH, and all that. So I was thinking it'd be cool, maybe you can describe laxation and the process of crystal formation.
Yeah, no worries. I think it's a topic that gets a lot of focus on my accounts online, just because of how pretty salts are when they grow into their formations, rather than just a chaotic crust. So there's some tricks in doing that. I think it's great. It attracts a lot of attention, but I think it, just because of its beauty, but then it brings about a lot of important points. So, the word is lixiation, and lixiation essentially means to leach a substance or to extract a soluble substance and separate it from an insoluble substance. So, a lot of the posts you see on my account, at least, are crystallizations of plant salts. So in this case, The soluble portion are the water-soluble mineral salts, and with plants, land-based plants at least, the primary salt is potassium carbonate. And then the insoluble part is the ash, which is often a lot of calcium, which is not so soluble in the water. So a big thing with proper crystallization really is about patience. It's about supersaturation and very gentle evaporation. So the process is actually quite simple. You're taking your calcined plant material, so you've burned away all the organic materials, and that's a really important first step to properly calcine, to make sure that there's no contaminants like organic like burnt materials left over, so you get a really clean salt, because crystallization is largely dependent upon the purity of your solution. You don't want a whole bunch of impurities which can interfere with the crystals and make a more chaotic or contaminated final product. So you want to really burn your plant material well, which can take a lot of time, and it's best to really grind up your ashes to a really, really fine powder. It's almost like to the consistency that it's like soft. If you're to press your finger into the ashes when they're ground up properly, they'll actually like fill your fingerprint. They're so fine. Or if you calcine on glass, you'll see them like they'll like slide across the glass, almost like they're levitating. They're so light. And they should be really uniform in color too, or really it's a lack of color. It should be very light gray or white, and that's indicating that all the organics are burnt away. So once you have your calcined ash, you're then really just leaching or dissolving these water-soluble salts in distilled water. Distilled water is used because you want a water that's not containing any other salt, so you have a pure sample. You're not contaminating with if you're using mineral water or water from a spring or a lake or something, there's going to be other salts in it. So you want something that's totally pure. So distilled water works best. And then you're heating that solution just to increase solubility. The hotter it is, the more salts you're going to draw out of the ashes. So that can be repeated multiple times. And this is where pH comes in, because distilled water is neutral in pH, so it's around 7, and the salts in the ashes are alkaline. So as long as you're still increasing alkalinity as you add the ashes to water, and you know that there's still salts there, so you can extract them one time. And I use a lot of water because there really is a lot of salt and you want to get it all out. So I'll cover my ash, 20 or 30 times its volume with distilled water, filter that out, and then I'll extract the ashes again with fresh water. And each time when you add water to the ashes, you can test the pH of the water. And if the pH continues to rise higher than 7, then you're still getting salts. So that's a great way to know that you've exhausted your ashes and you've extracted all of the potassium alkali salts out. So now you have like a bunch of water, distilled water, that's full of these potassium salts. And the next step really is to evaporate. So my technique is to start the evaporation at a fairly high temperature, less than boiling. You don't want to boil and risk spattering and losing water that'll fly out of your vessel. But I'll get it just below boiling point and start to reduce it. And then once you start to see salts start to precipitate out of the solution, you know that your solution is now super saturated, because it can no longer hold all the salts, and that's why you see them start to precipitate. So at this point, I'll transfer the supersaturated liquid to like wide glass baking trays. And at this point, I evaporate the remaining water at a really low temperature. The lower, the better. Really, optimal crystal formations I find come out of using about body heat, like around 37 to 40 degrees Celsius, and just very slowly allow it to evaporate. And if you've done a good job at calcining your plant material and it's, you know, a very pure sample, there's no burnt organics left in it, you'll get very beautiful salt crystal formations. That's how I go about it with the basic plant spagyric work, to get really pretty pure crystals of mostly potassium carbonate.
What are your thoughts on dehydrators? Do you feel like that yields more or less results, or do you have any experience with that?
Dehydrators work great. You just want to use a unit where you can really control the temperature well. Because they have a fan blowing over them, they can kind of expedite the process a little bit, but it's not too much. So, you know, if you could set it as low as 40 degrees or even 35, if you have the patience, dehydrators work great. In fact, I use them. I don't always use them. It depends on my batch size and things like that, but a dehydrator is a great way to like set it and leave it. And you're often using less electricity than, say, like a regular oven in your house or something like that. So I'm a fan of dehydrators.
And so the next thing I wanted to talk about was glasses to oils. So in mineral works with something like rose quartz, for example, or maybe antimony, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is it sort of like a standard procedure that you'll first form your glass and then you'll use that glass to create an organic oil from that? And
yeah, so well, yeah, glass work is like a dry path of alchemy. Sometimes it's a mix of dry and wet path, but overall it's the dry path. So it's a method of using what's known as a dry menstruum instead of the typical wet menstruum. Like menstruums are essentially solvents, and the most common ones we know of are things like alcohol or vinegar or even water. And of course, these are all liquids. And so these liquids are used to draw out whatever constituents we're looking for, you know, out of plants or even minerals, metals, animal materials. Whereas the dry menstruums, they work in a similar way, you know, leading to, you know, whatever you're looking to extract. But of course, they're not liquids; they're dry. So the dry path is mostly a path of fusion, where you're taking certain, it's often salts, mixing them with the material that you're looking to extract and fusing them into glasses to open them. Largely, this is done in the mineral and metallic kingdom, and in their, you know, metals in their base state as a metal are essentially closed, except in very special situations, let's say with very specially prepared alkahest, metallic, the metallic state is kind of closed. So if you have pure gold metal or, you know, silver or iron or anything like that, or just, let's say, you know, a gemstone even, you know, in its raw state, it's very closed. So it doesn't want to give up its soul, which is, you know, essentially an oil that we're looking to draw from these materials. So dry menstruums, salts essentially, are a way to open up these materials to allow you to produce oils. So often, actually plant salts, the potassium carbonate, also sometimes referred to as tartar salts, are used because they melt at fairly low temperatures, and they're very penetrative. They're very good at getting into metals, minerals, gemstones, opening them up, and basically creating a soluble form of these metals, minerals, gemstones, in order to proceed with the next steps in creating an oil from these materials.
Okay. And so I might be a little confused, or maybe I'm missing something. So when you use these salts as the menstruum, are you basically crushing, say you heated your quartz, you got it to a glass, you crush it up to maybe a powder, and then are you just essentially blending or mixing that powder with the salts, and nothing else is added, and then you're heating it from there?
Yeah, well, yeah, you generally only need two substances with this particular method. So you have your potassium salts, which are derived from plant ashes. A great way to get them is if you have a wood stove, to save your ashes and leach the salts out of your ashes, purify them and dry them very well, and crush them into a powder. And that acts as like your flux in the glass making. This is what really allows for things to melt down and turn into a glass at relatively low temperatures. Again, like the potassium salts, they melt right around 900, like just below 900 Celsius. I know it's pretty high temperature, but relatively speaking, compared to other, say, minerals and metals, it's fairly low, and it'll basically bring down the melting point of other substances. Like, for example, quartz, which is silica based. Quartz has a much higher melting point, but when it's mixed with the tartar salts, the melting point drops, so it makes it much easier to make glass. So you've got your tartar salts, your purified plant salts, and you dry them, you powder them, and then you melt them. So you melt them all by themselves first, get them into a good liquid state, and you're using a forge for this. And once they're melted, then you can take a powdered gemstone or powdered mineral or metal and start spooning in small amounts of this substance you want to open up into the melted tartar salts. Often the materials you're using, let's say it's quartz, they're often calcined before you add them to this glass mix. So this is it's a way of oxidizing, essentially. It's also a great way to break down really hard crystals. You can heat them really hot and then drop them into cold water to shatter them, and it makes it much easier to grind them down. But by calcining, you also can oxidize certain minerals or metals that are in your material, and oxides tend to work a little bit better as far as opening them up and getting a good oil from them eventually. So that's sometimes an important step. It's not always necessary. Some things work just fine, as like, I've had pure quartz crystal that wasn't calcined that produced a great oil too. But yeah, you're melting the plant salts, and then you're slowly spooning in powdered gemstones or metals or minerals, and then you're continuing the heat, and it's like cooking. It's really finicky with time. You really have to pay attention to the right moment to pour your glass, because you want to have a clear glass. A clear glass indicates that your substance is completely melted and become homogeneous with the tartar salts. They're not separate any longer. They've become one thing, and a clear glass is a good indicator of that. So this could be really tricky, and it's different with every substance you work with too. Also, too, the potassium salts, they actually vaporize as you're doing this, so you're losing salts all the time. So sometimes you have to add a little bit more to keep it liquidy enough to pour. It's finicky. You really have to watch it, and you can test it you can take like an iron rod and dip it into your melted salts and metals or crystals, to kind of do a little test to see when you take it out, does it solidify into a clear glass, or is it opaque, or are there, let's say, multiple colors indicating like things haven't really melted together yet? So you have to, it's a process of continuously heating and stirring and testing until you get to the perfect moment when the potassium salts, the tartar salts, or the plant-derived mineral salts, have fused homogeneously with the substance you're trying to open, like quartz crystal. And at that time, you can pour the glass onto, a metal tray, like stainless steel, or some people use copper or even marble, and pour out the glass to cast it, and it should solidify when it cools down into a clear glass.
Wow. And when you were talking about when you heat them and then you drop them into water to help kind of shatter them, would you use something like cold distilled water, or does that matter in this instance?
Yeah, just to keep things pure. I mean, you always want to try your best to stop outside contaminants from coming in. It's kind of the concept of keeping things hermetically sealed. You really want to make sure that, your results are actually coming from the substance that you're working with too. You don't want to add adulterants from outside. So distilled water is always best when you're doing that, so you're not introducing something foreign to your work.
And so, okay, so after you're done, you get it to the right consistency where they fuse together, and then you pour that, solidifies, and then after this, would you recrush it, and then what do the processes look like after that's all done?
Yeah, there's a couple ways you can go about this. One really interesting way is to take the glass. Now, the glass, again, you've started with potassium carbonate as your main salt, right? Potassium carbonate is alkali, and it's quite hydrophilic. It loves water, so it'll absorb water, right out of the air, like the moisture in the air. You can deliquesce it. It'll essentially melt. It'll take on the water from the air and turn into a liquid. When you melt the salts, because you're introducing really high heat, the potassium carbonate actually turns into an oxide. So you're oxidizing it through heat. And potassium hydroxide is an even stronger alkali, and it's also very, very hydrophilic. It loves water. So once you've got your glass, if you crush it up into a powder, you can leave it out on a glass tray at night, particularly when there's a lot of humidity in the air. So the spring and the fall are great times, and those are also times when...
Would this be like an open top glass?
Yeah. Yeah, you want it to be completely open to the atmosphere. I mean, you could, have some sort of covering to try to stop dust from getting in there. Like you could put it below like a big screen or something like that. But really, you could just filter the substance, like the liquid afterwards, if anything gets into it. But open air, so it's has access to this moisture in the atmosphere, and so it'll absorb that and turn into a liquid. And this is also the time, like spring and fall, when there's a lot of humidity in the air. That's a time when it's said that there's the most secret fire in the atmosphere, this animating force, universal force that animates everything and also can create really, really powerful menstruums and alkahest to work with metals and minerals and even plants. It's this life force that animates everything. It's said, like, in the springtime, when you start to see everything start to grow, like this is this life force coming back in abundance and bringing everything back to life. So this is a way to capture that. And it's a bit of a debatable issue, but many people believe that the dry path will kill the substance that you're working with through its high temperature. So in the case that you subscribe to this belief that the high temperatures of fusing glasses will kill the life force in the substance you're working with by leaving the glass out at night to deliquesce and turn into a liquid with the dew in the air. This is a way to reintroduce the life force, universal life force, back into your substance. So you're reanimating the substance at this point. So you'll have a very, very thick, it's almost like an oil liquid when these salts completely dissolve. And with this liquid, when it's fully saturated, you can actually float a solvent on top of it. Something like, some people use metallic spirits, like their solvents created through dry distillation of metallic salts, or wine tartar. These are crystals you collect from wine barrels. It's potassium bitartrate. These can be dry distilled to create special menstruums, which are great at catalyzing oils from metallic and mineral substances. So these substances, they won't mix with the water, essentially. This highly alkaline water won't mix with something like pure alcohol or these metallic spirits. So the spirit will actually float on top of this liquid. And if you gently heat it, a color will rise up into the top layer. And this is said to be like the soul of the metal or the gemstone. This is the sulfur or the oil that you're looking to extract. So that's one way of proceeding. And the other way is just to crush the glass and react it with what's often referred to as like a philosophical or living spirit. So this is a solvent, a menstruum that's created with alchemical methodology. And these living substances or spirits, they're different than commercial spirits. Let's say a philosophically produced alcohol is different chemically than, let's say, a commercial alcohol. Like in this case, let's say a commercial alcohol has been refined to the point that it's a very, very high purity. There's really nothing left in it except for alcohol, ethyl alcohol, and a little bit of water. Now, a philosophically produced alcohol, through the gentle and tedious methods that you would, distill wine, let's say, and get an alcohol, it carries organic volatile compounds, essentially like very volatile aspects of the sulfur or the soul of the base material. Let's say you distilled wine, the base material is grape. So you've got these traces of organic oils or acids which are in your rectified alcohol. So it's chemically different than a commercial solvent like ethyl alcohol. And these are very important substances, because I think it's an important point to make that you don't extract oils from metals and minerals and gemstones. You create oils from them. So what's happening really is your salts that you've created with the glass are reacting with the solvent that you add to them, and they're catalyzing new compounds. Like the salts are having this catalytic effect on, let's say, the alcohol or acetone, let's say, from a metallic spirit, and all of these trace organic acids, volatile compounds that you get from quote unquote philosophically produced menstruum, and it changes their structure. They start to polymerize, they start to bond together and form new compounds, and these new compounds are oily, and they're actually quite similar to plant essential oils. When you analyze them, you see things like hydrocarbons and alcohols and ketones and phenols, and these are all the chemicals that you find in like the essential oil of a plant. So really what's happening is the salt is reacting with the solvent that you've used, creating or catalyzing new organic oils. And so this is a very important point about this, because really, and anybody can try it themselves, like a commercially produced spirit like acetone or alcohol, they often don't work at all, or they will work much, much slower, or the oils that they produce will be, less aromatic and flavorful. lighter in color. You can really see a big difference when you use commercial solvents compared to philosophically produced solvents or menstruum.
Yeah. There's this company, you may be familiar with them, Organic Alcohol Company. Very simple name. I think they're out of Oregon. Have you heard of them?
Yeah, they're the guys that make grape alcohol.
They do. They make actually a variety. They got like coconut, grape, pear, a bunch of different ones. They actually sent me some samples at one point, but I was wondering if you would consider that a philosophical grade alcohol or not.
It might be. Really, it depends on their methodology. And I think, I mean, you can kind of do an organoleptic test on this. Like if you've got a bunch of samples from them, you'll be able to tell just by smelling and tasting them. Like you may have 5 different alcohols, which all test at 95 or 96% purity. But if each of them has their own unique smell and taste, then you know that those unique trace volatile compounds, which come from the base substance, like the fruit, like a pear or coconut or a grape, you know that they're there. Yeah, if you smell them, they're there. So that like essentially you could consider that a living spirit. It's got that part of the soul of the base material in there, and that's a big part of what makes a successful catalytic oil from metals or gemstones and minerals.
Yeah, I think they're like the one and only I've come across, at least here in the US, that actually produce that quality within how they're doing things with, it's all organic, like 190 proof, 200 proof corn organic alcohol. Like, I know a few other alchemists out here in the States that use them for a variety of things as well. So I think that they're pretty solid. But yeah, just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I did come across them before. In fact, I contacted them about getting some from them, but they weren't licensed yet to export to Canada. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any. But yeah, this in this case, like it's probably what you could consider a living alcohol or philosophically produced alcohol. Now, that being said, like with the glasses, my personal preference is to use metallic spirits, or my most favorite and what I use the most is tartar alkahest. So that's it's a spirit that's produced from dry distilling wine tartar. So when you make wine in wooden barrels, you get this precipitate salt that builds up on the sides of the barrels, which is mostly potassium bitartrate. It's basically potassium bitartrate soaked in wine, and you can dry these crystals and then dry distill them. So basically, heat them at very high temperatures to produce a spirit, which is mostly acetone based, but really it's very complex in all of its trace elements. There's all these different organic compounds that come along with it. In my experience with metals, minerals, gemstones, in all the different ways that you can work them, this is the type of menstruum you want to use to catalyze an oil, because they're very rich in these different organic compounds that will be changed when they come into contact with the opened minerals, crystals, or metals that you're working with.
All right, and then so another thing I wanted to revisit, I think I touched on this with somebody a while back, but I've kind of forgotten the details, but ENS extracts. And yeah, I think I just kind of need to refine my knowledge on this. It's been a while since I brushed up on it. And one of my friends he was recently asking me if I'm aware of any sigil or symbol associated with the ENS, and I haven't come across anything personally. I've been looking, and then so kind of in thinking about that, I was trying to think about what an ENS extract is and the processes, so I can kind of contemplate what would best represent a symbol for the ENS. So yeah, if I recall, ENS extractions, they have something to do with like a vegetable magnet. I don't know, maybe you can just kind of lay it all out and give the scoop on the ENS extracts.
Yeah, for sure. So this actually touches on some of the stuff we've just spoken on with the glasses. This is kind of like a more gentle method. And it should be clear too, like the most common recipe that people refer to at the ends is known as the Hartmann recipe. And Hartmann was a biographer of Paracelsus, and he wasn't actually a practicing alchemist. So his version is kind of highly contested by people who really look into it. It doesn't look a whole lot like the original recipe from Paracelsus, but it is a worthy exploration and does produce worthy medicine. So that's what I'm going to speak about today. So this is, again, featuring the plant salts, the potassium carbonate based water soluble salts that you get from calcined plants. So again, this is acting as a solvent in this case with plants. So you're taking your purified and dried potassium carbonate from plants, or let's say from ashes from your wood stove. And again, you deliquesce them at night when there's lots of humidity. So you're allowing them to liquefy into a very caustic, high alkali solution, which is very, very thick and heavy. These salts are very water soluble. In fact, you can fit more than a gram in a single milliliter of water. So it's quite heavy. So you want to basically have a saturated aqueous solution of potassium carbonate. And this is what you start your extract with. So with that, you're basically macerating plant material. So you can take fresh or dry plant material. Often with the ends, people prefer using the fresh living plant. You want to soak it basically at a like 1-to-1 ratio by volume. So just enough of this what's called oil of tartar or oil of angels, this liquefied tartar salt. You want to mix that 1-to-1 by volume with pulped up, like ground up fresh plant material. And really it extracts quite quickly. So you only need, let's say 1 to 3 days. Really 1 day is usually enough. And then you're going to strain out that plant material, but very carefully. And this is something people often miss. When you're doing this high alkaline extraction of plants, what happens is it pushes out the oils of the plant, and these oils will float to the surface of your solution, sitting on the top. So if you run this through, let's say, a coffee filter, you're likely going to lose a lot of your yield of this oil that you're seeking. So you want to run it through, like a mesh, like stainless. You can use like a fine stainless steel mesh, or some people use like nylon or things like that. I preferred, a really, really fine stainless steel mesh. And you pour it through and collect your liquid. And then you want to test it to make sure that it's still saturated with the salts. This is a really important part, because the next step won't work if it's not fully saturated. So the best way to test it is to add some more salt to the solution to see if it'll dissolve. So once salts won't dissolve in the liquid any longer, it's fully saturated. I usually add them until there's a little bit of salt that's undissolved, so it's good to go. And then on top of that, you can pour what some people call a vegetable magnet, and generally what people are using is just very highly rectified alcohol. Now, alcohol, usually at its highest purity, you're buying it or making it, distilling it around between 94 and 96%. It's very hydrophilic too, just like the salts. It loves water. So by distillation alone, you can only get to that purity level. But really, you want an anhydrous alcohol, like a dry alcohol in this case. And to achieve that, you can actually, again, use the tartar salts. These tartar salts, for practical alchemy and spagyrics, it's an invaluable tool to have. You should really have a good store of it because it can be used for so many different things. But again, because the tartar salts love water, in fact, they love it even a little bit more than the alcohol loves water, you can add these tartar salts to your, let's say, 96% alcohol, and it'll draw out that remaining water. And then you can distill it again to achieve 100% pure alcohol. And what this allows is for the alcohol to float on top of that alkaline solution of the plant that you've made. The oil of tartar, again, is very alkaline, but it's water based, and usually alcohol and water would mix. They're totally miscible. They will mix at any amount together. But when you have this really, really salt saturated water and this really, really dry alcohol, they're immiscible. They won't mix together. So the alcohol will float on the top. And if you remember what I said about the oil, the alkali solution pushes out the oils of the plants and they float up to the surface. So if you pour alcohol on the top, these oils that are sitting on the top, which is the pure ens, and ens means entity. Sometimes it's referred to as the primum ens, like the first entity, like this kind of primordial or primal essence and entity of a substance. This oil floats to the top. You pour the alcohol on top, and the alcohol will wick up that oil, the ends, which then can be separated and either used as a tincture like that, or you can evaporate gently that alcohol and retrieve like a pure ends oil.
So if you were to contemplate a symbol that maybe you would use yourself for an ends, what do you feel would be like the most applicable? Or do you have any ideas?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't put much thought to it, but I mean, it could be something so simple, right? I mean, it's representing this like kind of higher soul or essence of something. So it could be as simple as a dot. I think of even the symbol of the sun, just a circle with a dot in the center. It's like the center of the center, the primum ens. There's kind of different layers of your soul, right? This is meant to be like the purest beginning of the soul. So something like that, or combining it with the sulfur symbol, maybe like a dot in the triangle of the sulfur symbol. Just some kind of, yeah. I mean, these are just off the cuff. I've never really thought much about it, but I mean, I'm sure there's different ways you could represent it, but think of it as it's the first entity, this kind of higher essence of a substance. And one more technical point too, which I think a lot of people overlook with this type of extract, is that if you're looking to have the pure ends oil of any plant, it's really important not to shake up or stir your mixture, like when you add the alcohol to extract the oil. If you do this, you're still making a valuable medicine, but it's a much more full spectrum extract. It's like when you take this really alkali substance, this oil of tartar that you've created, and mix it with plants, it'll precipitate a lot of salts, creating these salts with active components in the plants, and they actually fall out of the solution. They don't go to the surface. And this is more of like the fixed sulfur of the plant. It's the lower soul of the plant, whereas the part that floats to the top is the higher sulfur, or the most volatile aspect, or unfixed aspect of the sulfur. It floats. So if you're looking to just have that pure ends oil, it's important never to shake or stir your mixture. So you're only extracting that oil, and the extraction should actually be quite fast. Actually, a great example of this is with lemon balm, which is probably the most famous plant known to be used with this recipe. If you do this properly and gently, the ends of lemon balm is like this brilliant emerald green. Now, if you shake up the bottle, you'll get like a red color instead. Or even if you leave the alcohol floating on top for too long, you'll start off with an emerald green extract on the top, but then it'll slowly turn red as it starts to draw up more of the fixed sulfur. So really, it's like a delicate procedure. It's a very fast procedure because, again, the oil is floating on the surface of this liquid before you add your alcohol. And, anybody who's worked with oils, like volatile oils and alcohol, like they dissolve quite readily into alcohol. So it's almost instant. You put this alcohol on top, it turns, let's say with lemon balm, this brilliant green, and then you've got it. It's time to remove that alcohol. And you could try extracting again to see if you get more green, but you want that pure first entity of the plant. You have to be really gentle with it. No stirring, no mixing, and very quick extraction with your alcohol.
All right. And then something else I wanted to ask you that kind of popped into my mind when we were talking about the salts. So when I'm evaporating something like sea salts, and then afterwards I have this very like white, these leftover, it's basically just white powder. What am I getting when I do this process, and could this be used to deliquesce and be used for any of these similar sort of processes?
When you're using sea salt?
Yeah, if I'm like I've evaporated sea salt just in water, and then it kind of creeps up the jar. It's just like this white, it turns into this white salt. So I don't know if that's like any kind of form of purification of the salts, or what are any potential applications? Like, could I use those salts to then deliquesce and then use those for other alchemical processes?
Yes and no. Well, firstly, like when you're performing the lixiviation on sea salt, you're purifying the salts. Like, so you can repeat that process of dissolving the salt, evaporating and crystallizing, re-dissolving, and repeating the process over and over, which is often referred to as turns of the wheel. And this will help you purify your salt, get rid of other impurities as you filter out, to get down to that, in the case of sea salt, just very pure sodium chloride. Now, sodium chloride is not very deliquescent, so it wouldn't be great for, let's say, this ENDS process that we're talking about, because it's not going to draw up water in the same way, and it's not alkaline either. But sodium chloride is a really important salt. Sodium chloride is the base substance for producing philosophical hydrochloric acid, essentially, which is known as spirit of salt. And for those familiar with it, this is a key ingredient often in opening gold. Gold is a tricky metal compared to other metals. It requires a little bit of finesse that all the other metals don't require. and the spirit of sea salt is one of the ingredients in what's known as aqua regia, the king's bath, which is 3 parts hydrochloric acid and 1 part nitric acid. So sea salt is the prima materia, the base material that you're going to use to produce this spirit of salt, which comes from dry distilling pure sodium chloride.
Okay. All right. And then I want to bounce back to the ENDS real quick. And one thing that I learned actually from your website when I did one of my episodes, reading through a few of your articles, and I hadn't really made this connection until I was reading them, but the difference between like an essence, an elixir, and a tincture. And if I remember correctly, that the essence is more volatile compounds. The tincture is going to be the more fixed, and then the elixir is kind of a balance of the fixed and the volatile. Is that correct?
Yeah, in the way that I prepare them, that's how I kind of classify them, through their volatility or fixity.
And then, so with something like a spagyric tincture, with it being more fixed aspects versus something like an ENDS, is the difference that the ENDS is Yeah, I guess what would be maybe is it just a lot more sulfur based with the ends or
Yeah, well, it would be more focused on its volatile sulfur.
uh,
Um, and to go deeper into the ends, I mean, and this is something I think that's worth more research, but it's said that the ends process is meant to separate a full tria prima of a plant all on its own, like without calcining or distilling or any other operations, just by simply soaking a plant in this oil of tartar or angel oil, as some people called it. It's said that the three essentials, the higher aspects of these three essentials, float to the top to be taken out. And certainly, I think there's a little bit of modern chemistry that could support this, in the sense that we know that essential oils will get pushed out and float to the top. We also know that when your potassium carbonate solution is very saturated, that it repels things like organic solvents, like ketones, like acetone, or alcohols like ethyl alcohol, which we can find in plants. So we know also that it's chemically possible that, let's say, the spirit or mercury of the plant can be pushed out. As far as the salts go, I think that's like the biggest question for me. But we know that the potassium salts can bond with the volatile sulfur, the oils of the plant. So certainly there could be salts in the final ends product. But I think it's arguable that it's probably not the salts actually from the plant material used. That being said, like the ends is predominantly of the volatile oil of the plant. So it's leaving behind its more fixed aspects. And that was my point about not mixing or stirring the ends, right? So it's different from a tincture.
Yeah, I guess I asked that backwards. I should have asked the difference between an essence and an ends and not a tincture, because that would make more sense.
Yeah, no worries. And I mean, again, I think these determinations, or definitions like tinctures, essences, elixirs, when you start reading different authors, you'll realize there's really no universal standard for these things. So this is I've learned a lot from many other people, and I take a lot of these definitions from people that have taught me, or books that I've read. It's what makes sense to me, but it's not a universal system. It's just where I sit with it, and I think it makes sense. But when you're looking at this scale of fixity to volatility, the essences I classify as the most mercurial of the preparations. Mercury is the most volatile of the substances of the tria prima of salt, sulfur, and mercury. So essences compared to the ends would be even more volatile. So when I'm preparing essences, I'm using very, very low heat and distilling off only the most volatile compounds. So you're looking for the most volatile aspect of the sulfur, which is a small fraction of, let's say, the essential oil of a plant. You're looking for the most volatile aspect of the mercury, which in most cases is going to be alcohol, pure alcohol. And then you're looking for the most volatile aspect of the salts, which are volatile salts, which with plants is generally sal ammoniac, like ammonium chloride or ammonium carbonate. All of the tria prima in the case of the finalized essence, every aspect of it is volatile. Whereas, let's say, tincture on the other end, you have all of the fixed sulfur, all of the fixed salts. So it's quite heavy and fixed, even though it also includes the volatile sulfur or the mercury, the alcohol. It's got all of the fixed components of the plant. So it's the heaviest. And then an elixir, or in the case of an ends, where you're kind of focusing on, it's a mix. You've kind of got this homogeneous equilibrium of the volatile sulfur or ends oil that's a result of, or in combination with, the fixed salts. So it's somewhere in between. Now, like essences are, I consider them more, they're associated with the mercurial aspect of the Tria Prima. So it has to do with like information, where the sulfur, let's say that's the predominant compound in elixirs or in the ends. Sulfur is about the soul, or emotions. So this is where you can start to kind of determine what's the right medicine for a certain ailment or condition or aim that you have with taking something like this.
And then, so just to double check on, so was it your contention that the elixir would be the closest to an ends? Was that what you were saying? Because it has fixed and volatile? Or was I misunderstanding?
Yeah, like if you had to compare it, yeah, if you were comparing it, because it's heavily focused on the essential oil, really, and that's what the ends is predominantly focused with, separating this oil which floats on top of the oil of tartar, and it's largely composed of the essential oil of the plant.
Okay.
And that's what, like in my case with elixirs, that's what the elixirs are focused on, is the volatile oil or essential oil of the plant. So they're similar in that case.
And then so lower heat, you're going to get more volatile coming over, and then high heat, you're going to be pulling over more fixed compounds. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that depends. I mean, there's so many degrees of heat, right? Like if you can craft an essence from a tincture, you can distill a tincture. Now, if I use very, very, very low heat, I'm going to get the alcohol, and then I'm going to get just the most volatile aspects of the essential oil of that plant. But if I bump up the heat a bit more, I might start to grab at more of the terpenes in the essential oil of that plant. So you can change it by a small degree in that case. But then there's also dry distillation. You can continue to heat past the point of receiving all the moisture of whatever substance you're distilling, and then you can break down solids by degrees of heat and bring over even more compounds. So, I mean, simply, yes, like the degree of heat will control what comes over as far as volatile or medium volatile compounds, and then more fixed compounds, which eventually will volatilize if you heat them enough, or essentially burn them in the case of pyrolysis, dry distillation.
With ends processes, are there any ends processes for mineral or metallics that you're aware of, or anybody working with anything like that?
Well, that process with the glass really is the closest, where you deliquesce the mineral or gemstone glass that you make, and then float a pure alcohol or metallic spirit on the top. That's just like an ends, but with a mineral or a gemstone.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so I'll talk about iron, which was some of the most beautiful photos that you have on your Instagram. And the virtue of iron, and something that was in your article when you were writing about it. You were writing that it takes a specialized menstrua. So yeah, I would assume, in terms of its virtues, iron maybe it would definitely have some virtue in regards to maybe potentially helping with something like maybe anemia. But yeah, I was curious maybe a little bit about some of the other virtues with iron, and then also if you could elaborate a little bit on that specialized menstrua that you're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with the second question, because we've spoken about it a bit, but again, with the specialized menstruum, with iron, again, it's all about these specialized metallic spirits, or the spirit you derive from wine tartar. Find these work the best with the minerals and the metals and gemstones. The only other things that I know of that work well with these substances are menstruums that you can make from dew. or menstruums that you can make from urine. So these metallic or wine tartar based spirits are the specialized menstruum that I'm referring to, and many of them will work. They'll all produce different types of oils, even with one base material. Like you could have a salt of iron and react it with 5 different types of metallic spirits, and if you were to analyze that final oil, they will all have unique aspects of it. They may have like a base element that are similar, but they'll all catalyze something unique, based on the type of spirit you use. So that's a specialized menstruum that I'm referring to. Iron, iron's a tricky one. No worries, and I know there's always a delay on my internet, so it's hard for us to kind of go back and forth. There's a delay on my upload speed. Yeah, iron's a tricky one, and I feel like iron's one that's kind of always gnawing at the back of my head because I feel like I haven't quite cracked it yet. I've made some great medicines from it, but I don't feel like super confident with it. And I think it's funny, the last time I worked with it, I think the article you're referring to, I had some of the best results I've ever had. Like salts volatilized, I got a thick oil from it. It smelled and tasted delicious, and it was really great. But I think a lot of the success that I had, I really didn't understand. And that's kind of where I feel like it's still gnawing at the back of my brain. Sometimes these things happen, like some people spend so much time and effort to try to, let's say, get a salt to volatilize. And then other times, like, it just happens and you don't know why. And iron was one of these things where, it was sitting and, basically maturing, this gentle heat in a flask, and it crystallized these beautiful tree-like patterns. Some people call it the tree of life up the sides of the glass. And I really don't know why it happened. I've done the same process before. And it never happened. So iron's got a special place in my mind right now because I really don't feel like I've cracked it completely. Sorry, what was that?
Oh, I said the mysteries of iron.
Yeah, it's a weird one. Like its acetate salt is weird to work with, so the acetate path is a little different. You can still do it, but it's got a bunch of abnormalities about it. The case where the article you're referring to and where I had these great results, I'd started with basically by opening it with citric acid, actually, creating iron citrate. And iron citrate, in regards to the other question about anemia, iron citrate can be used as a supplement of iron. Usually iron supplements all on their own aren't really that great, and they can be quite dangerous, actually. But iron citrate is used in that way as a modern medicine or supplement. I'd read about this technique from another alchemist named goes by the name Rubiphilus, and to be honest, I was really skeptical of his technique, and I found that it largely just produced iron citrate crystals rather than a true oil. I won't dive too deep into the technicalities of that, but that's kind of where the work started. And it advanced into many other steps, which did eventually catalyze a clean oil and created these beautiful salts. But really, it was like feeling around in the dark. It wasn't a super confident process. It was more of an exploration of it, really, with frustration of trying to figure out what is the best way to work with iron. But yeah, iron's special. I mean, it's the metal of Mars, right? So it's got a lot of fire to it. Assertiveness, fiery energy, metabolic energy. So it's an important one with a very strong personality to work with.
Absolutely. And in terms of like dangerous forms of typical iron supplements, would this maybe have something to do with like the particle size in terms of bioavailability, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, without going too far into it, I think largely what the problem is, and it's not just iron, but particularly with iron, because excess amounts of it can be problematic, is that I think our bodies just are not designed to take in these micronutrients by themselves. I think, they're delivered generally by nature through our foods, plant foods or animal foods with iron. In these, agglomerates, they come with many other compounds, like we know now, like vitamin C helps metabolism of iron. And, if you eat some spinach, you get the vitamin C and you get the iron, and you're very unlikely to overdo your iron levels by eating spinach. Whereas taking an isolated iron supplement, there's a lot more risk with it. Now, I know there can be safe applications of it. Some people really need it. But largely, I find when you look at the research of isolated minerals and things like that, vitamins even, is we often don't metabolize a lot of it. I call it expensive pee. We end up just peeing out a lot of it. You take like a B complex vitamin and your pee turns like nuclear orange, and it's a bunch of stuff that you didn't assimilate, right? So I think there's something to be said about these micronutrients and how they come in packages of micro and macronutritional substances, which allow our body to kind of use them more readily or use them on demand as they need them in a safer, more full spectrum way.
Yeah. And I was kind of thinking, because like in regards to metabolism and whatnot, I don't know if this is the case, so I'm going to ask if you have any insight into this, but like in terms of plant spagyrics kind of creating those micelles that you have written about, that sort of lend itself to being more bioavailable and easily digestible, if I'm getting that right. Is this the same thing that occurs within metallic spagyria as well, or has that been looked at?
Yeah, well, particle size is really important, I think, when you're thinking about bioavailability and, penetration into hard to reach areas of the body, like getting past blood-brain barrier, for example. So particle size, I think, has relevance for most substances that you're ingesting. And certainly with the plants, it's this form of herbal nanotechnology, as I called it, where you can create these nanoparticles of like organic and inorganic substances, the salts and organic active compounds of the plants. They form these little pairings together, which are very, very bioavailable, largely due to their very small particle size. Metallic oils and gemstone and mineral oils are the same. I mean, you can verify this with the same method, which is the method of using a laser. You take your substance, your liquid of whatever it is, a metallic tincture or a plant-based spagyric tincture, and bring it in the dark and shine a laser through it. And when they're colloidal, which is colloids are nanoparticles, it's a particle size, very small. You can't see it with the naked eye, but the path of the laser will illuminate the particles, which are suspended. They're not in solution. They're not dissolved like sugar in water. They're actually suspended. They're tiny and stable in suspension. That's what a colloidal suspension is. And certainly well-made metallic oils do the same. And in fact, it's quite interesting because usually you're trying to remove all the metals, because let's say you're working with a metal like gold. You're creating generally a chloride salt of gold to catalyze an oil, and gold chloride is toxic to the body. So you want to be able to catalyze an oil, but remove the toxic salt. Now, when you do that, you create this oil, and often in the sweetening process, depending on how you work, gold chloride can actually be reduced back to gold metal. And this metal, or even the chlorides too, can actually form colloids that are bound with the new oil that you created. So with certain metallic oils, you can actually have a combination of both a totally new substance, which you've catalyzed, an organic oil, and that organic oil kind of acts like a secondary solvent eventually, which can draw in metallic colloids, which bind with those organic materials that you've created. So it's like, it's just like the plant spagyrics, where you have the potassium salt and the organic oils of the plant. And in this case, with the metals, you have the organic oils which you catalyzed, and then colloids or nanoparticles of that metal, which are bound to the new organic compounds that you created. And in this case, like metallic colloids like gold, they're safe to ingest in comparison to, say, like the salt of gold. So yeah, very, very, very similar, and very interesting, because colloids of noble metals like gold, I mean, they're used in modern medicine as delivery mechanisms for drugs, because they're great at getting drugs deep into the body and to target sites that are hard to reach without this kind of taxi cab of a nanoparticle of the metal. So this is the same thing is happening with the metallic oils, some of the metallic oils that are created in these processes.
So is this what's taking place? You sent me this awesome, the three magi spagyric, and I think within it has colloidal gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And is that like a similar thing taking place within that?
Yeah, totally. So in this case, you're not catalyzing an organic oil like you do with like pure oil of gold. But what's happening is you're getting gold into a solution. So you're using aqua regia, creating this chloride salt of gold in solution. And then you're using a distilled essential oil of a plant. In this case, I used frankincense. And that oil will float on top of the solution of the chloride salt. So again, it's very similar to the ends. These are all called liquid-liquid extracts. When you have two immiscible liquids, they don't mix together, and you can separate a substance from one solution into the other. So in this case, you've got a solution of gold chloride, and then you've got a distilled essential oil from a plant. In the case of the three kings you're talking about, it's frankincense. You pour that oil on top, and essentially immediately you start to see these tiny little particles. They look almost black at first, but really they're dark purple, separating out of the bottom layer, which is the gold chloride layer, which is very bright orange. And they start rising up like bubbles into the top, into the oil layer, this essential oil layer. Now, the essential oil of frankincense is clear, or sometimes like a very pale yellow, but the oil I used was colorless, and you see right in front of your eyes it start turning yellow, and then a deeper like orange, and then eventually like a scarlet red as these particles of gold rise up from the chloride solution up into what we can refer to this as a vegetable magnet. It's a vegetable magnet for the gold, and the gold is rising up as colloids and binding with these terpenes, the volatile acids from frankincense, and forming these organic and inorganic aggregate compounds bonded together. And it's metallic gold. It converts into metallic colloids. So they're no longer salts that they were originally in the solution of aqua regia. And eventually that bright orange solution of the gold salts turns clear. So the oil will actually draw up all of the gold out of your solution into the vegetable oil, which is how that's the basics of how that three magi elixir that I gave you is made.
Yeah, I absolutely love that one, by the way. It's amazing. I'm wondering, have you taken on lead yet? Have you worked with lead any alchemical spagyric formations or anything like that?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned lead. For me, has been predominantly a source of like a great metallic spirit. So lead acetate can be dry distilled to create a metallic spirit, which is said to work really well with gold and other metals as well. But yeah, funny you mentioned, because just today I was filling up a jar with some lead oxide powder with the intentions of starting a bunch of work on lead. So I've got lead oxide, and I've also got a natural source of lead where you can get your lead oxide from. It's called galena, and so this is like the naturally occurring form, so like a living stone, we could say, not a commercially processed stone. You can process that to create different salts, like oxides or acetate salts to do different paths. So I'm about to really dive into catalyzing the oil of lead and also really refining the process of dry distillation of lead, which it's another way to produce an oil rather than catalyzing an oil with a specially prepared solvent. With dry distillation of lead acetate, it separates into a few different substances, but two of which essentially are oils. So you've got a light oil which floats on your distillate, and it's usually like a yellowish color and clear and floats. And then you've got a blood red thick oil, which sinks to the bottom of your distillate when you dry distill lead acetate. So these two oils are created, and they can be further rectified and refined, and that is another way of deriving an oil out of lead.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you've got going on with that, and maybe reading some articles. I was talking to Jesse Lath over there at Inky Apothecary in Australia, and he was getting me hyped up on the lead. He was talking about potential like benefits of it and whatnot, and it was pretty interesting. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of people working with it and really proper ways and creating good quality medicines with it for sure.
Yeah. Lead is, I think it's a big topic, right? I mean, being the base metal, the metal associated with Saturn, it's like everything is all there. It's like the first, it's got all the layers on it still, but often it's referred to as like a secret sun, right? It's got all these leaden shells surrounding it, but inside is this latent sun of gold. So it's the beginning point. So I think it has a lot of importance in that sense. It's obviously got a lot of lessons for us, and you see that even just in its physical characteristics, it's quite toxic. So I think it speaks to the same process we're all going through, right? It's a difficult journey of unraveling ourselves and peeling back all of our leaden shells, which are hiding away, our latent inner gold or inner suns. And that could be a bit of a laborious, dangerous, difficult process, and philosophically speaking. And I think the same thing kind of mirrors in the actual lab work with it. It's very toxic substance, very heavy substance. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to diving into it deeper and finding its inner sun.
Absolutely. It's essential in producing what's called philosophical mercury too. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, some people would say it's the best. I think it's arguably, I would say that it's not, because I think mercury is universal. Mercury, that universal spark of life that animates everything, it's everywhere in everything. So you can derive it from anything. And I think that's something that's spoken about a lot, especially when referring to the Philosopher's Stone, is that, really it's everywhere, and you can make it from anything. So philosophical mercury, even in the literature, you see it being derived from many, many different things. I think one of the best books on this is Das Acetone by Becker.
Oh,
and Das Acetone is yeah, it's amazing because really it's like the first book to really reveal this big secret, right? Which is dry distillation of acetates, which is what led to industrial production of acetone, which we no longer produce it that way. It's synthesized, but originally that's how we produced industrial amounts of acetone, was dry distillation of acetate salts. And so you can derive quote unquote philosophical mercuries from any of the acetate salts, and many authors have spoken on different starting materials. And like I referred to too, they may all have, most of them have a similar basis in acetone being produced, but they all have unique organic acids, organic volatile acids, which they're unique to the mineral or metal that you start with, and then they will produce different substances as a result of that. But they're all considered to be philosophical mercuries, although lead is quite famous, or maybe infamous, for that.
Yeah, I need to get that book and check that out. It's been on my list for a while now. All right, I want to get into living waterworks and their medicines. How have your explorations with waterworks sort of unfolded? What were some things that you've been able to maybe verify for yourself, and or just any particularly interesting revelations that you think are noteworthy?
Yeah, for sure. I've done a fair amount of work with water, not maybe as much as I should, because it really is kind of mesmerizing how much you can draw out of just water, and the different things that you can achieve with just water. So maybe I can start by just explaining like a basic process that's often done with water, which is simply to ferment it or let it rot, and then distill it into fractions. So usually what you're doing is collecting like a living water. Often that's collected as like rainwater, or rainwater from thunderstorms in particular. It's often considered quite a masculine source of water, whereas dew is often considered a feminine source of water, archetypally speaking. You take these natural waters and you basically leave them to rot or ferment. And so it's interesting collecting water in a sterile vessel. Like you can sterilize your, let's say, glass jars or something like that, so there's no contaminants in it, using some pure alcohol or something. Collect this water, you can cover it with let's say some cotton, the tight elastic on it to seal it so it's got oxygen and everything, and you just leave it in a warm, dark place for a while. A nice roomy vessel too. You don't want it to evaporate, or I've even had success completely closing the vessel too, even without allowing oxygen. But this water you've collected from the air in a sterile vessel, after some weeks or sometimes months, grow these, what I assume to be mostly bacterial cultures, which is referred to as the universal gur. So right off the cuff, you're harvesting this life right out of the sky, which is amazing to start with. So you're fermenting, quote unquote, this water and letting this life build up inside of it, and then you can gently separate that through filtration or decanting the clear water off, saving behind the solids, this gur, this culture that's built up. And then you can distill the water into fractions. You can distill it into 4 fractions, which would represent the elements, going from the most volatile fraction first to the least volatile fraction last. There's different schools of thought on this. Some people think it's fire first, and then air, water, and then earth. Some people say it's air first, then fire, then water, then earth. But regardless, the idea is that the most volatile fraction comes off first, and then it descends in order from there. Those 4 fractions can be further distilled. You can distill those 4 fractions of the elements into 3 each, and then you have 12 fractions. And this is often referred to as like the salt, sulfur, and mercury of the elements. Or you can also find association of these 12 fractions with the zodiac signs. So you can distill the water into these different fractions, and from there, things get quite interesting, with experimentation. Things like freezing all the fractions and seeing that the fractions will freeze at different rates. You've distilled water, so essentially in your different flasks or jars, you should just have water, but they start behaving differently, like freezing at different points, like the earth fraction freezing more quickly than that of the fire or the air. And another thing you can do too is start to mix these fractions and feed them back to that separated gur, that bacterial culture that built up. You can feed them back to it and start growing different things. I've experimented with that, and sometimes it'll grow things that look kind of like plants, like almost like little ferns or something growing, or like more like algae. And some things look more like, if anybody's familiar with making like kombucha, like more like a SCOBY, which is kind of essentially what this is, this bacterial culture, but that looks a little bit more like bacterial life, which we could consider, more animal. Sometimes it grows things that appears to be like salt or crystalline in nature. These different fractions like fed back to this solid bacterial culture. The gur will grow all these different substances just using different fractions of water, where you can seemingly grow things from all 3 kingdoms, at least by, I've never chemically analyzed these things, but by eye, it appears to be, looks like plant life, or looks like animal life, or looks like mineral life, which is quite interesting. It's a little bit, feels like playing God a little bit, like you're growing life in your jars of different varieties. And I think it's there's obviously the whole of nature's evolutionary patterns kind of within this work. And the Golden Chain of Homer is a great book for anybody who's interested in this to really dive into. Really this like simple pattern which governs the evolution formation of life, and how really everything is made up of one thing. Therefore, you can create everything from one base source, because we're all made up of that same essential animating substance, which can manifest itself as anything and everything, metal, animal, plant. So water's got a lot of mysteries in it, and really it's kind of endless what you can do with it as far as medicine and menstruums and creation of different life, seemingly.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I think it was actually Bartlett that had really elaborated on some of these things for me and kind of just blew my mind. And I'm wondering, have you ever gotten anything similar to animal life with any of your experimentations?
Well, like I said, I beyond looking like, something's very similar to like a SCOBY that you'd make kombucha with, which, is obviously like a robust bacterial culture. Nothing beyond that. I'm not seeing any little shrimp swimming around in my fractions, but I haven't gone very far into it either. So, I think it's kind of mysterious, even to think back to the original creation of life on Earth. If we've got a planet that is full of, let's say, minerals and water, how did the first life form spring out? Like, what came first, you know, even like the first bacteria or whatever. Like, I think it's interesting to think about how life kind of sprouts out of, or animal life, as we call it, sprouts out of these, you know, pools of, of water and minerals and things like that. So I'll leave an open mind to it. I'm a pretty skeptical person too, and I think there's a lot of grandiose claims made by certain authors, but I try to leave my mind open to it. So yeah, I haven't seen anything swimming around visibly in any of my experiments, but I think it's clear that there's bacteria, and you know, obviously that bacteria probably has its base source in, you know, the water in the air. You know, we know there's bacteria in the air, so we're collecting that, but influencing how it multiplies and, you know, maybe which, let's say, strains of bacteria thrive in certain fractions of the water and which ones don't, and how you can end up with different results depending on the mixes of, you know, these different fractions of water that you've distilled. I think it's very interesting, and I'm not sure really what the full capacity of doing these processes is. So I'm keeping my mind open, but yeah, no little babies growing in jars yet.
Little homunculuses, yeah. The time will tell. Well, this was incredible, man. You're such a gifted educator, and I greatly appreciate always talking with you. And so I just want to ask if you have any last comments, any thoughts, any messages that you want to put out there for the listeners, and maybe where they can find you as well before we wrap it up.
Yeah, well, first, thank you. Likewise, I love chatting with you. You're always a great, you know, interviewer and host, and you know, you've given me a great platform to speak to lots of new people. So I really appreciate you, Sky, and you know, I always have a great time chatting with you. As far as a final message, I mean, we had a pretty good conversation tonight. We covered a lot of different ground all over the place. You know, really, I think for me, I think a big obsession right now, and we've spoken about it before, is really doing proper research into these metallic and mineral medicines, because I think it's clear to me that very unique, organic and potentially, you know, very therapeutic substances can be produced with these methods. But like most authors will warn, the path is dangerous, you know, and I continue to see very dangerous things being touted as, you know, safe ways of working with these medicines. And, you know, I just really encourage people to really take a step back and be humble with this type of work, and really to trust no other person's word. Don't trust my word, or don't trust, you know, even your most respected teacher's word. Really, you know, test this for yourself, you know, with your logic and the best of, I think we've got a lot of opportunity with modern resources of analytics. Let's say something as simple as testing the products, like to see if they have heavy metals in them, or testing the products to see what are these organic compounds. Because really, as much as we can theorize and go by what the ancients have told us about these medicines, which may be true, you know, what these medicines are good for. Gold is good for the heart, or silver is good for the brain. Maybe they are, but we don't have a lot of hard evidence. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence. And, you know, even outside of metallic salts, we don't know a whole lot about these organic substances which are created. I think we have a lot of hints that well-done oils are essentially safe to ingest, but these are super complex organic substances being created, which are hardly explored yet. You know, people like Robert Bartlett have done, I mean, he's probably done the most work into analyzing these substances, and you know, he said it himself, like the room for more research on this is gigantic. Like, these are super complex things. So, you know, I just encourage people, again, not to jump in head over heels, and really do your own due diligence and not just trust anybody's word. So I think that this research and this opportunity in modern times right now to have the benefit of being able to read the world's history of alchemists, essentially, all that work, and combine that, with the same, intentions, but with modern scientific analysis, not to throw out I don't think we should ever throw out the philosophical aims of alchemy, but we can use modern tools with the guidance of that same philosophical, the reason why things are, not just what things are, like really searching for why things are. We have a huge opportunity there. And I think, I don't want to, some people think I'm trying to disprove alchemy. And really, I think that this type of effort is only going to further prove the validity of alchemy and its techniques. So I would just, continue to push people in that direction, whether you're an interested person or a person actually doing this work. Push further for the truth and don't just accept anybody's word about especially these metallic medicines, which are said to be the strongest medicines of all of alchemy.
Amen, amen, amen. All right, where would you direct people to find any of your work, your websites, your socials, any of that stuff?
Yeah, so you can check out my work on secret-fire.com. My Instagram, I've got two. I've got my personal Instagram, which goes a little bit more into the heavier details of spagyrics and alchemy, and that's alchemia.arcadia. And then my business page is Secret Fire Apothecary. And those are both on Instagram. So that's where you can reach me.
Amazing. Thank you so much again. And until next time, brother.
Thanks a lot. Have a great night, Sky.